do quite a number of things. And one of them is gold mining here in Alaska. Started off in what I guess some are calling end processes, meaning would deal with difficult concentrates. But as someone that gets around, met a young lady in her advanced years that spent a great deal of time in mining and is an author here in Alaska. Rose Rybachek. And this is one of her books. Feel free to look for it on Amazon or look her up on the web. I'm going to read because there are people that are interested in Alaska gold mining, and it sounds like a good thing to have somebody listen to while maybe trying to go to sleep. Introduction. John and Tony Rybachek emigrated from Yugoslavia to the United States in 1898. They were young men when they emigrated, spoke limited English. They worked their way across the country to the Seattle area, arriving there sometime in 1899. John was probably 16 and Tony was probably 19 when they reached Seattle. I say probably since they were very coy about their ages. They became excited about the Canadian gold rush in the Klondike, and like many men before them, they headed north to make their fortune. The Klondike gold rush ended in the year 1899. Thus, they arrived in Dawson City too late to locate any of the richer ground. But they were sure that their pot of gold was just around the corner, so they followed the gold rush to various rivers in Alaska. They participated in several of the more famous gold rushes, and then the last major Alaskan gold strike near the town of Livengood in 1914. John was approximately 31 at the time, and while he didn't exactly strike it rich, he was quite successful working his claims. However, like most claims, his claim was nearly worked out by the late 1920s. Gold was discovered in the Tolovana River in 1928, directly below the mouth of Wilbur Creek. John was hired early in the spring of 1929 by the company that was mining the river. Their mining method required them to chop several holes in the ice of the Tolovana River and string cables between the various holes. They used ore cars pulled by donkeys or horses to excavate as much gravel as they could before breakup. Breakup for non-Alaskans is what we would call spring. It's basically the ice and the rivers break up. It's a very momentous and loud, many times occasion. And rather than spring, we refer to breakup. The goal was to stockpile the gravel and sluice it after breakup in the spring. One day, when another worker turned a cable loose, John fell into the swiftly flowing water and was swept under the ice for about 20 feet. He was lucky that he resurfaced in the next hole downriver and managed to grab a cable. Some of his fellow miners pulled him to safety. Coughing and gagging, he huddled in a blanket to thaw out. He quit his job on the spot. He never again went river mining. His English by that time had improved enough that there was no mistaking his "I quit." He had had enough. A couple of John's friends, Mr. Lynott and Mr. Healy, decided that after John's experience, they would also quit the company, and the three would strike out on their own. They were convinced that at least some of the gold that they were finding in the Tulana River originated from Wilbur Creek. The banks of the creek were on a gentle slope, rising higher and higher the further away from the river they walked. They found the boundaries of the claims their former company had staked, which were nearly half a mile from the river. The story was that they drew straws to see who would stake which claim, and John won the draw with the shortest straw. John staked his claim, which he called number 3, adjoining the mining company claims. Lynott staked claim number 4 next to John's, and Healy staked number 5 next to Lynott's. By the way, Healy is the name of a town up near Fairbanks, or on the way to Fairbanks. So this is actually referring to the founder of the name of that town. They estimated that the depth from the surface of the ground to the producing gravel was at least 20 feet where claim 3, number 3, had started. Their further assumption was that it would keep getting deeper and deeper on claims 4 and 5 as they moved further away from the river. They had big plans to mine all 3 claims in the next few years. The frozen ground is called permafrost, which is a very deceptive term. It is permanently frozen ground with the surface covered with grass, willows, and some birch trees. From their previous experiences, the 3 friends and partners assumed that the deeper the permafrost got, the more ice lenses it would contain. The ice lenses are solid sheets of ice that have been frozen for thousands of years. Some of them have turned black and put off a foul-smelling odor, and some were large lenses of clear ice. The dark ice lenses were about 90% water intermixed with 10% dirt. They called this combination muck. John and his partners decided they could remove this permafrost or overburden by using the then popular hydraulic mining method and uncover the pay dirt below for sluicing. Hydraulic mining uses water under pressure to wash away the overburden. They worked hard by hand the rest of the summer of 1929. They made a small dam near the middle of John's number 3 claim and built a drainage ditch to a small side creek on Lynott's number 4 claim. This ditch would catch the runoff water when it rained. They purchased a giant, some hydraulic pipe and a small pump and began their mining. The giant was a water cannon or a nozzle that they attached to their hydraulic pipe. Pipe connected to their small dam where they would set up the giant. Since they were starting off on the side of a hill, they needed to pump the water to their giant. Once they had the hillside down to gravel, they planned on using gravity from the dam to operate the giant. They used various size nozzles attached to the giant. The size of the nozzle depended on the water supply. Once they had their giant operating, it put out a large stream of water under high pressure. That is, when the pump operated like it should. But the pump they bought was old and very unreliable. It wasn't surprising that they soon ran into trouble. As they progressed with their washing of the hill, the growth of trees and dirt on the surface soon disappeared, revealing that indeed there were ice lenses underneath. A face began to appear, which is what miners call the vertical edge of the cut in the landscape that they are trying to remove. John and his partners worked at hydraulic mining all that summer. but they had miscalculated the amount of overburden, and their pump was broken down more than it worked, and the weather did not cooperate since it was a dry summer. The upshot was they were unable to reach their gravelly pay dirt. Not to be deterred from mining the ground, they decided to dig a shaft from the top of the permafrost down to the gravel and then on down to bedrock. And that way they could dig horizontal drifts, a mining term for a tunnel, at the level of the gravel. Using this technology, they would only need to remove the gravel that had gold in it. Knowing that they were going to spend the winter working on the shaft, they constructed what was known as a tent house. It had a wooden floor, wood walls up about 4 feet high, and they pitched a tent over this foundation. That fall, they started their shaft by gathering firewood during daylight hours and burning a fire in the hole. They let the fire burn all night, with one or the other of them taking turns feeding the fire. The next day, they would dig out what had thawed. However, once they were down into the massive ice lenses, the melting water put out their fire. No matter how hard they tried to keep it burning, and the project came to a screeching halt. The trio gave up and the partnership dissolved. John maintained his claim, hoping that someday a mining company with enough capital to mine the property would come along. No, about this time, a man by the name of Leonard Sapala discovered through research at the recorder's office that the two mining claims, the one staked by the company mining in the river and John's claim, did not align perfectly. Therefore, there was a fraction of a claim that belonged to neither of the two claims. He staked the property and built a cabin on it. Spala did quite a bit of mining on his fraction of a claim and left a rather large tailing pile behind. Interestingly, Sapala had earlier become famous in Alaska for his participation in the dog sled diphtheria serum run from Fairbanks to Nome in January 1925, when temperatures reached minus 70 below zero Fahrenheit. It was this serum run that sparked the current 1,000-mile Iditarod dog sled race run every year in Alaska. It was in 1936 when John found a well-capitalized mining company. They had a large boiler, a hoist, and pumps to remove the water. John made a deal with them, and the company was in business. Since they all believed that John's claims were very rich, the company agreed to pay John a royalty of 25% of the gold mined for the privilege of mining his claim. This was a very good contract for John, since it was above the going royalty rate. They began thawing the permafrost and were all quite surprised when they finally landed on the gravel in the shaft. And it was about 60 feet from the surface. No wonder neither the hydraulic method nor the simple shaft method the three partners had tried worked. As was the custom, the mining company built a cabin near the operation. This was a 2-story cabin. The ground floor was used by the cook to prepare meals and feed the crew, while the crew slept in the upper story. Interestingly, there was no ladder inside the cabin from the ground floor to the 2nd story. The only ladder was on the outside of the building. Was this because the cook was a woman and the miners were rowdy? That project only lasted a couple of years, ceasing in 1938. We learned they had a crew of 7 miners and 1 female cook. They found gold, but were barely making ends meet, with gold selling for only $35 per pure ounce. So they abandoned their lease. After the 7-man crew left, the claims remained neglected until about 1949. Then another mining company leased the mining claims. that ran from the river to John's claims, plus at least John's, Lenot's, Healy's, and Sapalla's claims. The main partner in this company was Tony Lindstrom, a well-known Alaskan miner. The Lindstrom Mining Company built a cabin on the already mined area near Sapalla's cabin. It used this cabin as a cookhouse while the crew slept in tents. The Lindstrom Mining Company had several exceptional mining seasons near the river and was geared up for another one in 1955 when it lost the pay streak. No more gold was going into the sluice boxes. The miners wondered who had turned off the spigot. They had been following the creek as they mined upstream, seemingly the ancient stream bed that had deposited the gold many thousands of years before, creating what we call the pay streak, had taken a sharp turn, and over the years, permafrost and overbuilding had built up. Since water takes the path of least resistance, the creek channel had migrated to the east. The Lindstrom Mining Company had been so successful in the last few years prior, it was not willing to give up and go home. It conducted an extensive exploration project. The company's engineers discovered that, sure enough, gold was still there, only lying quite a distance to the west. They used an old steam-powered churn drill to drill a hole every 100 feet, starting with the present creek and working their way westward. When a drill hole was productive, they marked it on the surface, stuffed a birch tree down the hole top first, and later they brushed out the pay streak on the surface by cutting the trees and clearing a trail from the drill hole to drill hole. Amazingly, the shaft that John and his first company had mined in 1930 was smack dab in line with the brushed pay streak. And years later, when we were mining underground, we actually found one of the birch trees. After finding and marking the pay streak, the company continued to follow it by the hydraulic mining method. After a season or two, health issues interfered and the claims became idle again. How are we doing? In 1958, my husband Stan was stationed at Ladd Air Force Base near Fairbanks. When he had time off from work, he dearly loved to get out into the rural areas and meet people. In the fall of 1959, Stan went moose hunting in the Livengood area, and his path crossed with that of John and Tony Rybachek, who still lived in the almost ghost town of Livengood. They became good friends, and for the next couple of years, John filled Stan's head with many stories of his mining adventures. Tony was the proprietor of the Livengood Inn, while John hunted and trapped. John was diligent in keeping current on his assessment work for his Wilbur Creek claims. When he first met Stan, John was then nearing 80 years old. He was no longer physically able to mine his property on Wilbur Creek, and even keeping up with the assessment work had become difficult for him. According to mining law, if a claim holder could not do his assessment work, or if he failed to record the papers showing he had done the work, he would lose title to his claim. For a couple of years after they met, Stan volunteered to help John with his assessment work. In the meantime, John convinced Stan that the property on Wilbur Creek was very lucrative, and that it would only take a year or two before it could be turned into a viable mining operation. Stan was on his second 5-year enlistment with the Air Force and had nearly served, at that time, the maximum 5-year hitch in Alaska. Thus, he faced a dilemma. He could re-enlist in June of 1963 and be transferred out of Alaska to another duty station, or he could get his discharge after having served 10 years in the Air Force. He was halfway to his 20-year minimum he needed for retirement from the Air Force. Stan loved Alaska. He was convinced that mining was an effective way to make a living, and after some discussion with me, he made the decision that when 1963 came, he would get his discharge. In 1961, he was thrilled when he successfully negotiated a lease with John of the Wilbur Creek mining claims. Soon Stan had recruited my dad to be a full-fledged partner, and Dad found a third partner, Curtis Reed. My dad, mom, and 3 siblings had moved to Alaska with us in 1958, and Dad and Kurt both worked on Ladd Air Force Base. By 1961, all the other mining claims on Wilbur Creek, except for John's, had been abandoned. The 3 partners staked all of the mining ground and, combined with Stan's lease, had rights to all of the historic Wilbur Creek claims. My dad frosted his lungs in the winter of 1962 and 63 and moved back to the lower 48. Stan and I bought his interest in the claims and then bought Kurt's. By the end of 1966, Stan and I were sole owners of the mining claims. We'll stop there.